James Wheeler, your information. Today's information.
I need you to understand what just happened. On January 12th, 2026, President Trump announced something that should have made headlines across every major news network. He imposed a 25% tariff on any country that does business with Iran. Not specific products, not targeted sanctions. Any country, any business. This is unprecedented in the history of American economic statecraft, and I'm going to explain why it's not a show of strength, but a desperate admission of weakness. My sources have been tracking this situation for weeks. Independent journalists on the ground, analysts who understand what's really happening in the Middle East, economists who see through the propaganda. And what they're telling me paints a very different picture than what you're hearing from the mainstream media. The American empire is losing its grip on the Middle East, and this tariff is proof. What I'm about to reveal to you is the story they don't want you to know. The story of how BRICS nations are forging an alliance that threatens the very foundation of American power. How China, Russia, and yes, even some of our so-called allies in the Gulf are building a parallel financial system that doesn't need the dollar. And how Trump's response to all of this is to threaten the entire world with economic punishment. Think about that. If the dollar was truly indispensable, why would you need to threaten people to use it? This isn't just about Iran. This is about the birth of a multipolar world, and the empire is terrified. The question you should be asking right now is simple. Why this, and why now? To understand what's really happening, you need context that CNN and the BBC will never give you. In June 2025, the United States carried out Operation Midnight Hammer, striking Iranian nuclear facilities at Fordo, Natanz, and Isfahan. This was part of a 12-day conflict between Israel and Iran that left the region more destabilized than at any point since the Iraq War. The mainstream media called it a victory. They called it necessary. What they didn't tell you was that it set in motion the very crisis we're seeing today. The Iranian economy went into freefall. The rial, Iran's currency, collapsed to its worst rate in history. By December 2025, $1 was worth 1.36 million rials. By January 2026, it hit 1.42 million. That's not an economic downturn. That's economic annihilation. In 8 years, the purchasing power of ordinary Iranians has fallen by more than 90%. Food prices have soared by 72% in just 1 year. But here's what they're not telling you about the other side of this story. While the empire was busy bombing Iran, the BRICS alliance was quietly expanding. In January 2024, Egypt, Ethiopia, Iran, and the United Arab Emirates joined the bloc. In January 2025, Indonesia became the 10th member. Saudi Arabia, the crown jewel of American Middle East policy for half a century, has been openly flirting with membership. And the infrastructure for a post-dollar world is being built right now. Russia and China settle 90% of their bilateral trade in rubles and yuan. China's cross-border interbank payment system, what they call SIPS, connects 800 banks across 185 countries. The BRICS Pay system integrates payment networks from Russia, China, India, and beyond. The mBridge system enables instant central bank payments using digital currencies. This isn't some future threat. This is happening now. And the empire's response is to threaten the world with tariffs. The pieces were all in place. Iran joins BRICS. China builds alternative payment infrastructure. Russia demonstrates you can survive outside the dollar system. And then, in late December 2025, protests erupted across Iran. The unrest began in Tehran on December 28th. Shopkeepers in the Grand Bazaar, unable to afford their own inventory, shut their doors and took to the streets. Within days, the protests had spread to more than 110 cities across all 31 Iranian provinces. People were chanting things that would have been unimaginable just years ago. Long live the Shah. Death to the dictator. No Lebanon, no Gaza. We sacrifice our lives for Iran. The regime's response was brutal. By mid-January, human rights organizations confirmed at least 0 civilians killed, including children. More than 400 people had been arrested. The Tehran prosecutor announced that protesters would be charged with moharabeh, waging war against God, an offense punishable by death. The government implemented a nationwide internet blackout. ATMs went offline. The economy, already crippled, was operating at 50% capacity. And what did the American empire do? Trump posted on Truth Social that help was on the way. He moved military assets into position. He threatened strikes. And then, on January 14th, he told reporters that he had received information that the killing had stopped and backed away from intervention. The empire promised. The empire hesitated. The empire blinked. But here's where the story gets really interesting. Even as Iran burns, even as the regime cracks down, even as Trump threatens to isolate Tehran from the global economy, the BRICS alliance demonstrated something remarkable. In January 2026, naval vessels from China, Russia, the United Arab Emirates, and South Africa gathered off the coast of Simonstown, where the Indian Ocean meets the Atlantic. They called it the Will for Peace 2026 exercises. China sent a destroyer. Russia sent a corvette. The UAE sent a corvette. South Africa contributed a frigate. Iran had planned to send a destroyer of its own. Think about what this means. This wasn't just an economic forum having a meeting. This was a military demonstration. For the first time, BRICS nations were conducting joint naval exercises. The message was clear. This alliance has teeth. And what happened to Iran's participation? They pulled out at the last minute. Sources indicate they were pressured to withdraw, downgraded to observer status because of Trump's tariff threats. The empire couldn't stop the exercises. It couldn't prevent the alliance from forming, but it could squeeze one member hard enough to force them to step back. This is the definition of a superpower in decline. Unable to prevent the challenge, only able to punish individual participants. Now we get to the heart of the matter, and this is crucial. Trump's 25% tariff isn't just about Iran. It's about sending a message to every country that does business with Tehran. China is Iran's largest trading partner. They import 80% of Iranian oil. From January to November 2025, China exported $6.23 billion worth of goods to Iran and imported $2.86 billion. Under this new tariff regime, the average American levy on Chinese goods would jump from 47% to 72%. The Chinese embassy responded by warning that Beijing would take all necessary measures to defend its interests. Brazil exported more than $3 billion to Iran in 2024, primarily agricultural products like soybeans, corn, and sugar. India, already facing a 50% tariff from the United States for the crime of buying Russian oil, now faces additional pressure. But here's what you need to understand. Historically, American sanctions targeted Iranian entities directly, or they targeted foreign companies dealing with those entities. This is different. This is a blanket tariff on all goods from any trading partner, regardless of whether those specific goods have anything to do with Iran. This violates the traditional rule that tariffs target products, not countries. This is the empire saying, obey us, or we will punish you for everything. And the question you should be asking is, why would a confident superpower need to make threats like this? The answer is uncomfortable for those who still believe in American hegemony. The threats exist because the empire can no longer simply command obedience. It must coerce it. Let me show you exactly how the de-dollarization agenda is advancing, because this is what they really don't want you to understand. Russia and China now conduct most of their bilateral trade without touching the dollar at all. 90% in rubles and yuan. Brazil and China signed a yuan-real trade settlement agreement in 2023. India has begun purchasing Russian oil in rupees. The infrastructure exists, and it's expanding. CIPS, China's alternative to SWIFT, now has 467 indirect participants across 119 countries. It connects 800 banks in 185 countries. When the West froze Russian assets and cut Russian banks from SWIFT, they thought they were delivering a death blow. Instead, they demonstrated to every nation on earth that the dollar system can be weaponized against them, and they better have an alternative ready. Trump knows this. That's why he threatened a 100% tariff on any BRICS country that pursues de-dollarization. 100%. On the first day of his second term, he announced this as policy. The administration has made clear that maintaining the dollar as the world's primary reserve currency is a non-negotiable priority. But think about what that admission reveals. If the dollar was dominant because it was the best, because American markets were the most attractive, because the global economy simply couldn't function without it, you wouldn't need to threaten people to use it. The very existence of these threats proves that alternatives exist and that the empire is terrified of them. Now, I'm not going to pretend the BRICS alliance is some unified bloc ready to replace American hegemony tomorrow. It's not. There are real divisions. India doesn't support a BRICS payment system, let alone a common currency. India's external affairs minister stated plainly, "I don't think there's any policy on our part to replace the dollar. The dollar as the reserve currency is the source of global economic stability." The 2026 BRICS summit will be held in India, a country that's trying to balance between maintaining relations with Washington and benefiting from the multipolar shift. There are tensions between member states. The UAE and Iran are rivals. Egypt and Iran have complicated relations. Saudi Arabia still hasn't formally joined. But here's what matters. The infrastructure is being built. The connections are being made. The alternatives exist. And every time the United States weaponizes the dollar, it validates the BRICS argument that the rules-based international order is really just an order based on American coercion. Let me bring this back to what's happening on the ground in Iran, because this is where the human cost of empire becomes undeniable. The Iranian rial has collapsed to its worst rate in history. Ordinary Iranians have watched their purchasing power evaporate by 90% over 8 years. Food prices are up 72% in a single year. The government has implemented a food coupon system to prevent mass starvation, something that hasn't been seen since 1979. Protesters are in the streets of 110 cities. They're chanting death to the dictator and long live the Shah. The regime has responded with live ammunition. At least 2,000 people are dead. More than 18,400 have been arrested. The Tehran prosecutor is charging people with waging war against God, a crime punishable by death. And where is the empire? Trump told protesters that help was on the way. He moved military assets into position. His national security advisors contemplated strikes, and then they backed away. The Washington Post reported that costs loomed, and Middle East allies lobbied for restraint. The empire that bombed Iraq, that destroyed Libya, that funded jihadists in Syria, suddenly discovered the virtue of restraint when confronted with the possibility of actually confronting Iran. What does this tell us? It tells us the limits of American military power are real. It tells us that the empire can threaten, can position assets, can make bold statements on social media, but when it comes to actually following through, the calculus changes. The costs are too high. The allies are too nervous. The bluff gets called. Here is the truth that no one in Washington wants to admit. The Iranian regime may survive this crisis, or it may fall. But either way, the American empire will not be the one that determines the outcome. If the regime falls, it will be because Iranians on the ground, at the cost of their lives, forced the change. Not because of American intervention, not because of Trump's tariffs, and the chaos that follows a regime, collapse in a country of 85 million people with a nuclear program, will not be something Washington can control. If the regime survives, it will be battered, weakened, but still standing. And it will have proven that even under maximum pressure, even with the world's superpower threatening its trading partners, even with its economy in ruins, American power has limits. Either way, the architecture that allows resistance to American hegemony, the BRICS alliance, the alternative payment systems, the bilateral trade agreements in local currencies, that architecture survives and grows stronger. Russia watched what happened in Iran and took notes. They've seen their alliances in Venezuela upended, Syria lost, the Caucasus in flux. Another ally falling in the Middle East would be devastating for Moscow. But they've also seen that they can survive outside the dollar system. They've seen that China will buy their oil. They've seen that alternatives exist. China watched and calculated. 80% of Iranian oil goes to China. Beijing needs that oil for energy security. But more than that, China needs to prove that being a BRICS partner means something, that joining the Chinese sphere of influence provides protection from American pressure. If Iran falls and China does nothing, what message does that send to the next country considering alignment with Beijing? The global South watched and wondered. For decades, the choice was simple: align with America or face isolation. Now there's another option. It's imperfect. It's still developing. But it exists. And every time Washington threatens a country with tariffs for having independent foreign policy, more nations start thinking about alternatives. What you're witnessing is not just a crisis in Iran. It's not just Trump making economic threats. It's the birth of a multipolar world in real time. The dollar still dominates 49% of international trade payments. It still comprises 57% of global foreign exchange reserves. The yuan is still less than 5%. The transition will take decades, not years. But the direction is clear. The infrastructure is being built. The alliances are forming, the alternatives exist, and the empire knows it. That's why a 25% tariff on any country doing business with Iran. That's why a 100% tariff threat on BRICS de-dollarization efforts. That's why the desperate, unprecedented measures that violate the basic rules of international trade. A confident empire wouldn't need to threaten the world. A declining empire must. I want to leave you with something important. The mainstream media will tell you this story is about Iran, about protesters in the streets, about a regime in crisis, and those things are real. The suffering of ordinary Iranians is real. The brutality of the regime is real. But the bigger story, the one they won't tell you, is about power, about who has it, who's losing it, and who's building alternatives. The American empire has dominated the global economy for 80 years through a combination of military might, financial control, and the simple fact that there was no alternative. That era is ending. It's not ending with a bang. It's ending with the patient construction of alternative systems. Payment networks that don't need SWIFT. Trade agreements that don't need dollars. Alliances that don't need American approval. The protests in Iran might succeed, or they might be crushed. The regime might fall, or it might survive. But the BRICS alliance will continue to expand. The de-dollarization effort will continue to advance. The multipolar world will continue to emerge, and that is exactly what they don't want you to understand. I've been tracking these developments for years. Independent journalists, analysts who aren't captured by think tanks funded by defense contractors, economists who see the bigger picture. They all tell the same story. The rules-based international order was always rules imposed by America. The free market was always free for those who obeyed. The choice between democracy and authoritarianism was always a choice between submission and sanctions. Now there's another choice. It's imperfect. The BRICS nations have their own authoritarian tendencies, their own rivalries, their own problems. But they offer something the American system never did. An alternative. A way out. A path that doesn't require accepting Washington's dictates. Share this information. Support independent media. Question the narrative you're being fed about Iran, about BRICS, about American power. The empire depends on you not knowing. It depends on you believing that there is no alternative, that the dollar is inevitable, that American hegemony is natural. None of that is true. The world is changing. The multipolar order is emerging, and the only question is whether you'll understand what's happening or whether you'll be surprised when the empire can no longer deliver on its threats. The situation in Iran will continue to develop. The BRICS alliance will hold its summit in India later this year. The de-dollarization infrastructure will continue to expand, and I'll be here, covering what the mainstream media won't, revealing what the empire wants to hide. This is not the end of the story. This is the beginning. The American century is over. What comes next is still being written. But one thing is certain. The old rules no longer apply, and the empire's desperate attempts to enforce them through tariffs and threats only prove how much the ground has shifted beneath their feet. Stay informed. Stay vigilant. The world they told you was permanent is changing faster than they want you to know.